We are back, and we are joined by Owen Jones and his adorable friend here, Whitman. Look at him.
Very adorable like this, not when he's howling. He was actually very well behaved before. As soon as we came on air, he suddenly decided he was going to be a little feisty little puss.
Oh, a little feisty. What does a cat howl sound like? I gotta know.
Well, This is a Burmese cat, and they're a chatty little group of pussies.
Oh yeah.
It's like, whoa! No, actually, he's worse. What he does, right, is he torments. He does trial and error. So what he does is he goes through different yowls because he's trying to work out which is the most annoying.
Yeah.
So he's like, roar, roar, and he's trying to work out. You can see he's kind of thinking which one's going to wind them up the most. Apparently, cats have because apparently we biologically trained to not be able to ignore the sound of babies crying.
Yep.
Yes.
And cats have worked this out. They work this out. They've got
serious?
the same frequency. Apparently so. They've got the same frequency. That's why you can't ignore them.
Wow. So, I mean, they're also a little devious. Like, honestly, they're kind of manipulative.
Oh, yeah.
Extremely. I mean, they are famously
I've never had a
manipulative,
cat. So I was dog person growing up. But, you know, my fiance loves cats. And I'm just starting to really entertain the idea of getting one. Sam has 2 cats and hates them. So that's, I hear from both sides. I mean, he openly despises them. Yeah,
these are compromised cats because Burmese cat is a very champagne socialist cat to have. I've been vilified for getting these cats, but they're the most dog-like cats. But you have to take them for a walk, but they're very attached.
Gotcha.
So they don't do their own thing. They're very demanding and manipulative.
And they don't attack you in the night or something like that.
Yeah, they have a little wrestle. We wrestle.
Right.
So.
All right. Well, I was very happy to meet him, and I'm very happy to have you on, Owen, because we'd been chatting a little bit, and I was looking for an opportunity to have you on. This ongoing horror is basically, I think, all I think about, and probably a little bit all you think about as well.
Exactly the same. Exactly the same. I mean, you know what is interesting, isn't it? I think both of us are not naive. We understand in terms of the dynamics of, I guess, you know, Western states, the Western media. I still can't get over the shock, you know, every day. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It's just the scale of the horror, the level of complicity, the level of deceit, the level of moral disgrace. It's odd. It's like we know the context, like we know why, like what's happening, why the media would behave in this way. That's why we do our own media stuff, isn't it? But it's still, I can't get over the shock, you know. Every day it hits me, and you know, I keep talking to, you know, I interviewed this, you know, young lad, Khalil, Palestinian Christian from Gaza. His father died of a heart attack during the siege of the church by the Israeli forces and couldn't get medical care, so that's why he died. And he was getting his family out, managed to raise the funds to get his family out, and he had his 18-year-old sister, and 2 days ago she's dead. And you just read it, and it's just things like that. The horror just hits you over and over again, doesn't it?
Yeah,
well,
it
you
does.
can't let them get away with it. So
I know, but the thing that I think maybe you're experiencing as well is I feel a lot of rage about the narcissism of so many Westerners who live in absolute comfort and have decided that it is the most important story in the world to talk about the feelings of Zionists and how they're unsafe, how they feel like they are under attack. And it's just this incredible disconnect where you see how walled off they are from their humanity and how insular their world is, that I just fundamentally cannot understand. And that's the thing that lately has been getting me all fired up.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I did a really interesting interview. So I was writing my own reviews. I mean, she was the interesting interviewee. Nara Milanich, who's a professor at Columbia University, and she's Jewish. And she was talking to the point you were making there, actually. What I was quite interested, see, very sweet, my cat, but not when he does this.
I like the soundtrack. Yeah.
It's 5 a.m, not so good. What she was talking about, because I was quite interested actually in talking about, you know, on the one hand, she was talking about obviously the weaponization of anti-Semitism, and she was talking about that. The fact that anti-Semitism is real, it exists, and across the world, it's rising in various forms. Often, actually, if you look at the likes of the Orban regime in Hungary, the overlap between anti-Semitism and pro-Israel is quite interesting in itself. But what is interesting is when you get, for example, Jewish students talking about a sense of feeling unsafe, and that's actually, I used to date this guy, Brazilian Jewish guy. He grew up in a very pro-Israel, I might have to get rid of him, pro-Israel family. And he said he first went to university and he was first exposed to pro-Palestinian sentiments. And he said he got a fight or flight response. He felt actual genuine fear, and his heart started beating faster. And he put that to me because now he has the same view on Palestine as you or I. He put it to me as just that was a real emotion. And what Nara Milanich put to me, because I tried putting this kind of what we do, how you navigate that. And she was talking about, how you distinguish between real, discomfort and actual harm, and the way that conversation's been weaponized. But the broader point you're making is, I just think we need to be very clear about what's happening here, which is this is one of the great crimes of our age. I mean, what we're watching is a genocidal mania, genocidal frenzy, some of the worst crimes being committed on a daily basis of our time. And those who supported this are morally disgraced, and they've lost public opinion on both sides of the Atlantic. And actually, to be honest, in Britain, it's quite interesting. A poll in mid-October, now we're talking the 19th of October, showed over 50% supported an immediate ceasefire. Another 16% said they probably supported an immediate ceasefire. And just 3% said they definitely oppose an immediate ceasefire, which is the same number who think the earth is flat. So actually in Britain already, they started from a low base. In the United States, you can obviously speak more about this, but, any critique of Israel has been far more verboten and just outside of what is, seen as you're allowed to talk about. And the fact now that more Americans than not, according to the polling, think genocide is being committed, that, a large majority now over those who don't oppose Israel's onslaught. So they've lost that. They've lost public opinion. They know it's only heading in that one direction. They know it has consequences in terms of what that means for arming Israel, in terms of diplomatic support for Israel. And they also know that their own position is under their legitimacy is in collapse. So they've tried to start a moral panic and redirect the real extremists, the real dangerous people, the ones protesting the genocide. And, that's their strategy. It's gonna pan out badly for them, because now what the world is seeing, on the one hand, are grave crimes being committed against the Palestinian people, both the violent onslaught, the famine that's been deliberately created, the genocidal statements made by Israeli leaders, officials, and other prominent figures in society. And now they're seeing people being beaten up, including middle-aged female academics who are saying, trying to intervene when students are being roughed off, themselves being brutally arrested. And they're looking at that, and it's having a transformative impact on how people see the world. People have seen too much. They can't unsee it. And it's not just the people who suffer the injustices, the people who are being arrested, who are going to remember that as a formative experience for the rest of their life, a searing sense of injustice that will never go away. The people watching it, because that phrase we always said, the whole world is watching. But that's a traditional kind of placard of protesters. That's never been more true. And I just think it's what they've done in terms of the protesters is in a desperate attempt to shift kind of scrutiny onto the people opposing genocide rather than supporting genocide. But it is backfiring. It's just politicizing more and more people. And I think that's really interesting myself.
I think it's really interesting, too, how it affects the future politics of this entire generation of basically anybody under 35, in part because in the United States, at least, it's a Democrat who is enabling this and helping, as president, helping Israel commit this genocide. It's got to be radicalizing in a way that I don't think we'll fully know the implications of. What I'm seeing with these demonstrators, too, is how they've basically taken so much of what they learned from George Floyd and 2020 and the Black Lives Matter protests there about intersectionality, about solidarity, and about, honestly, tactics. They're improving on this as well. I saw The Atlantic, or I think some other magazine, that was very upset that these movements had a spokesperson. And it's like, well, we're not going to do what happened in Occupy, where these reporters would go around and Fox News try to find somebody who they could have a soundbite of. We're going to be militant and organized in our opposition to this. Like, this is an education on fascism. The police crackdown on these protests, as the people who are supporting the crackdown claim victimization, I think says everything people need to know about how close, honestly, liberalism can come to fascism under this kind of pressure cooker.
Yeah, I mean, we see throughout history. I mean, look, I mean, if we're talking about the actual rise of fascism, it was actually always preceded with liberal democracies becoming more and more authoritarian. It wasn't just like so-called liberal democracy with all its limitations and fascism the next day.
Yeah. And
it's interesting if you look at Germany at the moment, where you have a nominally, supposedly, when people say centre left, what does it really mean? But the Social Democrats and the Greens, supposedly left of centre parties, also they're in coalition with the right of centre Free Democrats, but nonetheless, and they're launching this clamp down on protesters and anyone who speaks out. They're disproportionately targeting Jewish people. One piece of research suggested that about a third of those being deplatformed and arrested are Jewish. It's included actually many German Israelis. I interviewed a Jewish protester who was arrested there at the Palestine Congress that took place in Berlin, which was shut down by the police. And one of the German police officers was pointing at his skull cap and laughing. And he said you're being anti-Semitic. And then the police officer arrested him for offence to a police officer. And then those people were defiled as anti-Semites afterwards. What I just think is interesting about that, and the reason I raise that, is in Germany at the moment, the AfD, the far right, are on the rise. They're on the march, partly because of the failures of this so-called centre-left government to address huge problems in German society. And so you have this crazed moment where there's this idea of the racists of the left, because they're people speaking out against Israel's genocidal onslaught against Gaza, including Jewish people who have been defiled as anti-Semites. So you've got Yuval Abraham, who's an Israeli journalist who stood on stage at the Berlinale and denounced the occupation, and then the non-Jewish mayor of Berlin denounced him as an anti-Semite. The world turned on its head. And at the same time, you have actual racists with the AfD, who, by the way, have actual proper anti-Semites in them, on the march, being legitimized by a government which keeps demonizing minorities, not least Muslims, and using the question of Israel, incidentally, to demonize German Muslims, to make them kind of this idea of, often Muslim opposition to what's happening means they're anti-Semitic. So you can see in Germany, this is happening. This authoritarianism is happening under supposedly this social democratic-led government, when the far right are on the rise. And what they're doing is paving the way for something far worse, because what happens when they fall, you'll get maybe you could end up with a right-wing government, maybe supported by the AfD, and they will use the foundations laid by this to launch a far more aggressive assault on democratic rights and freedom. So Germany is a really striking example of where all of this could lead, and liberals are, the handmaidens of this. You can see that directly in Germany, in the way that liberals have built an environment where they've helped drive the idea of the real dangerous extremists, those protesting against this. And then that has consequences, and the consequences include these terrible, brutal crackdowns, which I think could foreshadow something far worse. I think you're absolutely right.
You're on point about that. And I'm curious if your assessment is similar to mine of the way that there's this, I agree that they're losing public opinion quite quickly, but the right has now jumped in this country. Now they completely ignored Gaza until these campus protests, and now they're making their support for the genocide immensely clear. Speaker of the House doing so, and it appears to me that there's this extremely dangerous conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-whiteness. That's a big part of it, and that cynical usage is going to have a ton of consequences down the line.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I've this argument that has been made, and you can see it by certain kind of on the hard right, who've argued that when you talk about, those who've talked about critical race theory being, I suppose, their classic, that's their kind of, that's the thing they keep attacking and setting up as their target, and they've argued that's actually talking about issues to do with racism and the way whiteness is used. That's actually a gateway to anti-Semitism. So you can see them doing that in that whole conversation. And I think what's so ridiculous is you've got the likes of Donald Trump and his movement, where he said repeatedly anti-Semitic things. And there's this long history of, as I said, anti-Semites for Israel. Richard Nixon is a really striking example of that, very pro-Israel and just a litany of anti-Semitic comments. So at the one hand, you've got this, you do have, in the Trump movement, he cheerleaded for actual far-right supremacists and neo-Nazis. And at the same time, they're using this to say, well, actually, because the way they reconfigured this is to go, Israel, in the way that before these sorts of people treated Jewish people as not white, in the way it's quite interesting, who was deemed white or not. The Irish were once excluded from whiteness, for example. But now with the state of Israel, they've redefined it as an outpost of Western civilization facing the kind of Muslim barbarian hordes.
Light versus darkness. I mean, this has been the Netanyahu from the beginning speaking about, basically the savages versus the civilized. Mike Johnson said the exact same thing here after visiting Colombia and getting booed down in the United States. It is immensely terrifying. I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, you're right. I agree. Well, it's exactly that. But some have been arguing. You can see this with people, by the way, came out from the New Atheist movement and the so-called New Atheists who just became raging, just obviously Islamophobes. And their argument
Sam Harris always was that.
Well, exactly. I mean, you get this argument of, well, actually, Israel's fight, it foreshadows the coming struggle with Muslims throughout the West, and they're on the front line, but we're next. Right. So you can see that kind of how that link is being used by those within Western societies who are clearly avowed racists, and they look at Israel as a template for how you deal with the othered minority. I think it's really dangerous, but you can see this with why the likes of the kind of far right international, how they lined up with Israel, and those who the sorts of people who pushed great replacement theory and other far right conspiracy theories. Why have they lined up behind the Israeli state? Because they've started to see it as a kind of the sort of ethno-state they want to build in other Western societies. I mean, that is how, whether or not people go, well, is that what Israel is or not in terms of how it's configured? That's what they see. That's how they're seeing it. And they're seeing it as a template for a coming confrontation with Muslims in general, and B, as building an ethno-state where you defend Western civilization. That's what they're looking at.
Right. Heavily militarized borders, maintaining a demographic majority of those who represent whiteness and killing anybody, and expanding. I mean, that's just a far right idea. Richard Spencer has praised Israel for years about this. So we're obviously on the same page there. I'm curious because you've been going on a lot of these shows in the UK and talking to Israeli spokespeople and having to combat a lot of these talking points in real time on TV. What's your view of these Western news outlets and how different the tone was when maybe, say, you were going on in October to debate a Zionist versus right now? And I guess what were some of your experiences during all of these media hits with sometimes literally just like Israeli spokespeople?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I went on, I had this pre-booked media appearance on Sky News in October before 7th of October happened, but it was, I think, on the 9th of October, and I had to go on and talk about this. And I wasn't on with an Israeli spokesperson, I was just on with a right-wing Labour MP. And that was, obviously, it was a far more, it was a very different context. It was absolutely outrageous what happened in that particular discussion, because
I remember this discussion, Owen. And by the way, this was like I basically had a mental breakdown and cried because I just couldn't understand. It was one of those things where the way that she was speaking to you and just completely disregarding what you were saying about the coming slaughter just put the pit in my stomach for what exactly we were seeing now. But keep going.
Exactly. And what was so disturbing about it was, and I've seen this sometimes, this racist trope which keeps circulating amongst apologists for the Israeli onslaught, which is they were protesting before the war even began. It's like, are you off your heads? Like, within 3 days, the official death toll in Gaza was the same as the death toll on 7th of October. I mean, there was a mass slaughter happening in Gaza from the get-go. And what I was trying to talk about at the time was that to try and just talk, A, about context, and B, about what was happening in Gaza as I was speaking, and that was regarded as beyond the pale and all the rest. I would note then that particular Labour MP went on a so-called solidarity mission to Israel in January and appeared in a photo shoot with other Labour figures, with Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president, who quite correctly is in South Africa's case alleging genocide against Israel in the International Court of Justice because of comments Isaac Herzog made at the time about collective guilt of the Palestinian people. The point I'd make is it's interesting. You're right. It's become easier to make just because the scale of the crime is so obscene. The point I would just make is this is the biggest scandal in Western journalism of our time. I know the bar was on the floor, and I know we could look at the Iraq War and the role of the Western media then. The point I would just make, and again, I'm not being naive here because I understand how it works in the Western media for a long time. The point I would make, and the point I was trying to make at the time when it was actually the beginning of all this, is Israeli leaders and officials at the beginning said what they were going to do. They were very clear. They weren't subtle. I mean, I interviewed Raz Sigal, an Israeli American associate professor of genocide and Holocaust studies, and he said it's very rare for intent to be so overtly spoken. And the point is, they said at the beginning, like, for example, the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, he said, we're going to cut off all the essentials of life because we're fighting human animals. He said on day 2 that he was lifting all restrictions on Israeli soldiers. On day 3, all restraints on Israeli soldiers. You had just multiple Israeli ministers and officials saying they were going to wipe Gaza out and all the rest. And they were going to encourage a mass exodus. The intelligence ministry had a document in the second week where the preferred option was to force the entire population into the Sinai Desert in Egypt. The point I'm making is, it was from the very beginning, you just had to listen to what Israeli leaders were saying. And I looked at some of these quotes. I did a Google search for the whole of October, and in most Western media outlets, they didn't even mention these quotes. But if we had a media which did its job, all coverage would be framed around what Israeli leaders and officials said they were going to do. And you know what? What they said they were going to do is what they did. It's literally the perfect guide. They said they were going to wipe out Gaza. They said they regarded Palestinians as collectively guilty. They said they were going to starve them, and they did all of those things. And that's what is so obscene, because
that's the horror of it. Yeah.
Well, that's the horror, because it was in full plain sight. We're not relying on leaked documents in the main. Yes. We're just relying on what was promised from the start. But Western media outlets decided these statements weren't even relevant, and they just framed it as a war of self-defense. And then later on, we can have a debate about, is this proportionate or not? Let's agree to disagree. And that is an absolute raging disgrace. And the legitimacy of the Western media outlet after this is not going to survive for a lot of people, because people have seen too much. The framing of the Western media, even now, they're trying to, because the scale of the crime is too big, so you can't just hide it. But they're still not framing it based on, from the very beginning, there was all these genocidal statements. They then executed what they were going to do. And because they can't do that, because then they would have to address their own failure to talk about that from the start and their own complicity. But that's why now even now when I talk about it, I went on debate this Hen Mazik, who's an Israeli influencer. I mean, he embarrassed himself, if I'm going to be brutally honest. But even then, it was like I was up against him and the presenter. Right. As though I was still the one saying the controversial things, because I was talking about how they imposed a famine deliberately, whilst I quoted from A, the evidence provided by what Israeli leaders said they were going to do, B, the agencies on the ground, and C, David Cameron, the foreign secretary, doing a public letter going through all the ways Israel was blocking aid deliberately from getting into Gaza. So it's a scandal, and we can't let these media outlets get away with it. They are complicit in a genocide. That's the fact.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. And you mentioned David Cameron there. What Labour obviously moved or sprinted away from Jeremy Corbin and his wing of the party. Kier Starmer has basically tried to move Labour back towards the right, towards the center. But the Conservatives are immensely unpopular right now in Britain, is my understanding, and are expected to kind of get shellacked in the upcoming election. How has Starmer adjusted any of his rhetoric since, in the coming weeks? Coming months, how has Labour changed, if at all, in supporting Israel?
Well, from the very beginning, Kier Starmer, this was 2 days afterwards, he was asked on radio, which was also filmed, he was asked, does Israel have the right to cut off water and energy? And he said, yes, I think Israel has that right. And what he did, bear in mind, Kier Starmer is a human rights lawyer by trade, which he spoke about before he got elected and then didn't say anything about afterwards. He understands, look, I know what Article 33 of the Geneva Convention says about collective punishment. I'm not a lawyer. I know what a war crime is and not. I know if you cut off water and energy to a civilian population, which is all you're doing if you cut off water and energy, you've committed a very serious war crime. He said they had the right to do that. A number of shadow ministers, as in people on his front bench, went on TV, backed him up. And then 2 weeks later, he gaslit everyone by saying he never thought Israel had the right to cut off the basics of life, even though you can hear what he said. It's just, that's Trumpian. All these liberals, he talks about post-truth politics, misinformation, the extremes. They're trying to make it upend reality. That was a classic example. And but what he did all the way, or what he's tried to do all the way, is basically just track the State Department. I mean, so in the way you occasionally get like hand wringing if the US administration does some hand wringing, they'll do some hand wringing. But what they do in practice is a really good example. Even when they backed a ceasefire after, 35,000 people have been slaughtered, when they finally backed a ceasefire, the Scottish National Party, the pro-independence Scottish Party, tabled a motion in Parliament which included a condemnation of Israel for collective punishment. Now, Labour said that's unacceptable. So they gutted that motion and got it taken out, because what that would mean is you would have to then take actions. If you've accepted Israel is guilty of collective punishment, you've accepted it's committed war crimes, you then have to end arms. You then have to you have to change your diplomatic position. And the point I'm making there is Benjamin Netanyahu knows that Western politicians, for domestic purposes, will wring their hands sometimes. Oh God, this is terrible. Look how many suffering. Oh God. Oh, we don't want to see all this death. But without any actions, it means nothing. So all is what the UK, another example, and this for me is one of the worst. I mean, look, it's also awful, like choosing moments. But, UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, which is Gaza's main humanitarian agency, and Israel launched a smear campaign to destroy it.
Still no evidence.
That's the point. So the International Court of Justice put Israel on trial for alleged genocide, and then coincidentally on the same day, we suddenly had a big story about UNRWA alleging links with terrorism and all the rest of it. No evidence provided, and the likes of the British government and others cut funding to it. The Labour opposition could have taken a stance then, but they didn't. They backed the ending of funds and said these are serious allegations that have to be taken seriously. And now they put out on the day of this new report, which shows no evidence for it, they put out, their spokesperson says, well, actually, this shows that we can trust UNRWA and all the rest of it. It's like, how dare you? You helped pave the way for this. So the point I'd make is they've done hand wringing. They ended up backing a ceasefire basically when the US government said they backed a ceasefire or an end of hostilities. All of this is often like, it's this, a vegetarian between meals. It's like we could, and what they mean in practice is they, even when it was leaked by a Conservative MP that the British government received legal advice that Israel had broken humanitarian law, which legally then necessitates ending arms sales, Labour couldn't even bring themselves then to say end arms sales. Instead, they said they should publish the legal advice. It's like, well, what? Like, it's all they've done all the way through is track what they think is acceptable based on how far the US government's gone, how much hand-wringing they've done. US government opposes a Rafah offensive. We can do that then. But it's toothless opposition, and they legitimised war crimes at the beginning, which enabled the British government to give Israel a blank check, knowing they were not under any domestic political pressure. And actually, if Labour put the British government under pressure, they could have forced, given how weak the British government is, into a different position. And that would have put pressure on the Biden administration, because a lot of Democrats would have gone, hold on, Britain's now saying this. It would have strengthened voices there. So, yeah, my view is what Labour did is a moral outrage and disgrace, and they helped legitimise one of the great crimes of our age. And all the hand-wringing in the world cannot make up for the fact that they legitimised war crimes and the mass slaughter of innocent people. And they should never be able to get away with it.
I mean, and I also am struck by the lack of lessons learned from following the U.S.'s lead as it relates to the Iraq War, which seemingly Labour should have understood, and yet we're still making the same mistakes over and over again.
Well, these are the sorts of people running the Labour Party, frankly, a lot of them, who, even knowing what they know now, would probably invade Iraq all over again. That's who we're talking about. These are people who, this is just their political cause and creed.
Right.
They're not people who look at, because what we've seen in the 21st century, and this is the tragedy of our politics, is we always get proven right in the worst possible way. Every single foreign military intervention now has been a catastrophe. Afghanistan, catastrophe. Iraq, catastrophe. Libya, catastrophe. And we're always right in the worst possible way. We were right about this. And they're never going to forgive us for being right about Gaza, by the way. This is the problem, you see. What happens is we say it's going to be a catastrophe, and then it's kind of often generally worse often than even we say.
Yeah.
And these ghouls, they walk from crime scene to crime scene, splattered with more blood as they walk to a different crime scene, going, we need some more blood, guys. And they're still treated and venerated as respectable, as statespeople, as moderate. And we're the fringe lunatics. And all we have to prove to show for it fine is our terrible vindication is a lot of dead people. But the fact is, this is why this has to be different. Because what they do every time, they've done this now on another catastrophe, which we said would be a catastrophe on its own terms and in terms of the human impact. And we were right again. But if we don't this time hold them accountable, because in the Iraq War, they just carried on with their lucrative careers. I mean, Tony Blair, the people who had to resign in Britain were the people who opposed the Iraq War, the people who were seen to be too critical of the Iraq War. Tony Blair ends up working for some multi-million-pound institute he has, partly funded by the likes of the Saudi dictatorship, with no consequences. And unless we force consequences on these people, including in the media, this will keep happening. We're stuck in a doom loop of death and destruction. So I think this is so important now that we don't let them get away with it. And that's why we have to just hold our ground.
Ahead of this Rafah invasion, which all satellite data seems to be indicating Israel is going to go ahead with, even though the Biden administration is saying, please don't do it, please don't do it. We're not going to make you not do it.
Here's some more material.
Here's some more bombs. We just...
Oh, no, but they might brief something to Axios. They might brief something to and go, oh, we're really sad.
Barack Ravid, new breaking news. Biden has a hernia because of how much Netanyahu is stressing him out. Anyway,
Biden really swore this time. He really swore. He didn't just swear, though. He said lots of swear words this time.
The ones you can't say after 11 p.m. Yes, right. I mean, the really bad ones. It's so ridiculous. But the other just horror. So as we await that horror, and it appears it's going to happen, there are mass graves that are continuously being uncovered outside of hospitals, and there are some indications, not confirmed yet, but there are children's bodies that are in these mass graves, and they could have been buried alive. Your reaction?
When you're living through one of the great crimes of your age, when you hear two words in conjunction, mass graves, that's a pretty big clue, isn't it? That's like the red flag, I would say. If you look throughout the great crimes of history, mass graves come up, and I would know that Gaza is full of mass graves, by the way. It's important that, look, this has actually been reported on, but, if you look at the work of, for example, Euromed Human Rights Monitor, they've been tracking the number, mass graves all over Gaza, which if we had independent monitors and, then we would, if suddenly this war ended now, and where there was actual access, you would just find mass grave after mass grave after mass grave.
And the death toll would be even higher than what Euromed has been consistently higher because they count people presumed dead under rubble. But
exactly.
Even they are an undercount, Owen, because we just have no idea. They've killed all the record keepers.
A drastic undercount. I mean, look, the reason it's an undercount is we have the official death toll of around 35,000, which is a drastic undercount. I mean, the official death toll has always been vindicated in previous conflicts. It's been the US privately, and Israel even have validated this one now. But it excludes those buried under the rubble, which is an unknown number. It excludes people who've been killed, and not been reported. But you're right, the health ministry, that Gaza's been destroyed virtually. So the idea that you've got accurate record keeping now is not really possible. But it also doesn't include people dying because the medical system's been destroyed. That itself is a genocidal act. You don't have a healthcare system. You impose a death sentence on huge numbers of people every single day. You impose a death sentence on people with heart conditions. You impose a death sentence on people with cancer. You impose a death sentence on pregnant women. You impose a death sentence on newborn babies. every single day. And that itself isn't in the official death toll. That's why we always use this very clinical sounding term, excess deaths. That is deaths above the norm. And that includes people violently killed. And we know, I'm afraid to say this, we know from history in this sort of total war that the most people are not killed by the direct violence. They're killed by the destruction of society, not least the healthcare system, which itself is, so when we look at these mass graves now, and we can see, the bodies dug up, they're wearing medical gowns, they have catheters, they have medical tubes sticking out, their hands tied behind their back, signs of torture. It's extremely clear, and we know this because Israeli soldiers have been bragging and boasting on TikTok for comic amusement about how they see the entire population is collectively responsible and guilty. Amalek, that invoking of Amalek in which Benjamin Netanyahu did, in which the Israelites were commanded by God to kill all men, women, children, babies, and livestock. Constant use of Amalek. The fact is, and I have to say this, the Palestinian journalists who has still survived, because we've had the biggest killing of journalists in a conflict in recorded history, are the lions of the world press back. And without them, we just wouldn't even have a clue about what's going on. But all I say is, they can't get access to a lot. They're suffering. A lot of them have to fight to feed themselves and their families, what remains of their families often. We don't have foreign journalists, obviously, with access to Gaza because Israel refuses to allow them in. So all we're seeing at the time is just the tips of the iceberg. And we can see here in these hospital grounds, vast numbers of people being dug up who clearly have suffered, have been, they pose no threat. If someone was a combatant and their hands are tied behind their back, they're classed under international law as hors de combat. That means they are not combatants; they are protected people. There's no ground; it's a war crime to kill them. So it doesn't matter, even if they go, "Oh, they're terrorists," and they use that as a catch-all term. Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, did a really good piece which showed that when Palestinians cross an invisible kill line, they are slaughtered, and then they are classified afterwards as terrorists, and then put in that toll of so-called terrorists. So the fact is, whether or not they were combatants, if they're under detention and they pose no threat, you can't kill them. And we know that civilians are being classed as so-called combatants, and we know they can get away with it because we can only rely on the testimonies of the remaining Palestinian journalists who haven't been killed, who are working under the most unbearable conditions.
They're heroes in every sense of the word, and it will be something when maybe in like 10 years they are valorized, but it's just not going to do too much good right now. But before I let you go, Owen, I just had to ask you a bit about that insane immigration policy that the conservative government in the UK passed earlier this week, which basically human rights experts say is unworkable, that it's also illegal, and it basically says disregards all existing international asylum law. And I don't know what the asylum law is in Britain. You can let me know. I would imagine asylum law there as well. And says, well, we're going to just deport all these migrants trying to come over to Rwanda without looking into their claims in any way that would constitute due process. What's happening with that?
So what's happened is so-called safe legal routes have been closed down by the British government. So we had more people claiming asylum at the beginning of the century than we do now. But now what happens is far more arrive by boats. That's still, by the way, a tiny fraction of the numbers arriving in Britain at all. We're talking about, a very small group of people. At the moment, as far as I know, the biggest group are Afghan refugees. People familiar with Afghanistan might recall Britain was involved in a certain war there for 2 decades. So a classic example of involved in often, terrible violence and then refusing to deal with the human consequences of it. Now, obviously, in the world, there are about 110 million displaced people. Most of those are internally displaced. The vast majority of those who leave those places are in neighboring countries which are poor. A very small percentage come to Europe, and of that very small percentage, a minority come to Britain, we take less than France and other countries. They're often people who speak English. So I've gone to form a refugee camp in Calais, and these are often people who are English speakers because of people might remember something called the British Empire, when Britain went around colonizing and stealing people's land. So a lot of them, all they have people they know here. So it's often people from, who have connections. Now, rather than have safe and legal routes, so people arrive by boat, and their solution is just to, everyone gets deported to Rwanda, which is ruled actually by a human rights abusing regime. Now, that was actually shut down by the Supreme Court here on the grounds that the government couldn't guarantee the safety of migrants and refugees when they arrive in Rwanda, and the court upheld that this was unlawful. They pointed to Rwanda's bad human rights record. So the government tried to bypass this with a bill which says basically Rwanda's safe. Just declare it by law. No, Rwanda's fine. It's fine to go to Rwanda. Now, this would mean, so if someone arrives here and all their family have been murdered in front of them and they've been tortured and raped, they get deported. So there's no case by
asylum
case
process, right?
No, exactly. Now it is performative cruelty because only a tiny number would ever go to Rwanda anyway. It costs the amount they spend as well. Not that they should be the point, but it's estimated it will cost $670 million to deport 300 people. So that's £2 million per person. So it's all of it is just symbolic nonsense. But the Tories have really wrecked themselves here because what they've done is they've made stop the boats their big kind of plank. But the boats are just going to keep coming.
Because they lost with the trans stuff now. This is the new
it's
people
personal
to hate.
control, but because the Tories have wrecked the country, but this country's a mess. So obviously you go, well, the health service is collapsing, living standards are worse than they were in 2008. The infrastructure is falling apart. This country is a real mess. So they're foreigners. But the problem is actually all they do is they've driven up the salience of the issue for often their core supporters, but those boats will just keep coming. So all it does is antagonize their supporters more, who then defect to a more right-wing party, which is another reason the Tories are in a mess, whilst obviously angering lots of people who think this is obviously terribly inhumane and ridiculous. So they've shot themselves in the foot. My own prediction is very few people will end up in Rwanda, if at all. And obviously there's a broader point about how refugees and migrants are treated in this country with terrible cruelty, detention centres here, for example, and the terrible conditions that they endure. But this is a performative act of cruelty, basically, in order to go, look how wicked we are to people who are fleeing. And,
he learned from DeSantis. I mean, he learned from DeSantis and Greg Abbott, who did that stupid stunt with Martha's Vineyard or sending, migrants to New York as well. This is the new frontier, I think, of far right politics, as we were kind of saying at the beginning, to wrap a bow on this. Heavily militarized borders, trying to keep the hordes of people of either black people, migrants, Arab people out of the country, Muslim people in this country, Latino people, and distracting from deregulation and far right austerity politics while doing so. So that's what we're up against, folks. Owen, where can people support your work? Subscribe to your Patreon, subscribe to your YouTube channel.
Just people to check out my semi-coherent babbling thoughts. They're just typing Owen Jones Talks on YouTube. So just Owen Jones. And my content overwhelmingly focuses on Gaza. I think like you, it's just all I can really think about.
Yeah.
And I just think, I do think we have, I do think our alternative media outlets like yourself, which I'm a huge fan, what you do is incredible. But, I've always thought, obviously there's an important role, but this is really important. I mean, I would never forgive myself if I didn't use my platform in that way. But we have to do this, and in order to bear witness, but also in order to try and encourage people to fight to stop this monstrous crime. So I've been using my platform as best I can to elevate voices as well, including Palestinian voices. I just mentioned, obviously, talking to this new generation, I just think of American Jewish leftists, I just think is so inspiring. Right. I think they're at the forefront. So it's just trying to elevate voices we need to hear from.
Well, you're doing great work. Big fan myself. I'll read this I am, and then we'll let you go. Seder Nomics writes in, because of the Gaza genocide, I started getting videos of Owen Jones. Immediately watched so many other clips of him. He makes every Zionist propagandist he debates look even more deceitful and incompetent every time. Absolutely love my favorite leftist podcast doing a crossover episode with him. So
I love it when my mum writes in. No, that's very sweet, honestly. Very sweet.
Yes, you're welcome back anytime to keep talking about this horror, but maybe we'll have some better news soon. Hope springs eternal, as Sam would say. Thanks, Owen. Really
keep up your amazing work, and cheers, guys.
You as well.